morning. I was asked to read you guys a story today, and so I wanted to share one of my favorites, the Sideways Stories from Wayside School, and I'm going to read the first chapter for you today by Louis Sakar. Sideways Stories from Wayside School. Chapter 1, Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher at Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th story. "If you children are bad," she warned, "or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples." Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count, but he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple, so he copied off of John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf never taught him how to add. And one day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. "Hey! That isn't fair," said Todd. "John was only trying to help a friend." So Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. "Does anybody else have an opinion?" she asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. "I do not allow crying in my classroom," said Mrs. Gorf. So she wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet. When they went home, they were too scared to even talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. And as soon as they walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, "God bless you," when Paul sneezed, and Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Terrence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Mauricia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door as Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear began to wiggle, and Mauricia opened the door, had 1 foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue. Mauricia became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk to help with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell on a piece of chalk. The 3 Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrence, Mauricia, and the 3 Erics, Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Louis, the yard teacher, walked into the class. He had missed the children at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. "I must be wrong," he thought. "She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples." So he walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples, and Louis, the yard teacher, came back into the room. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. "She must be the best teacher in the whole world," he thought. By the end of the week, all the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. "Now I can go home," she said. "I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again." "You're not going anywhere," shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her. "Stop!" she shouted. "I'll turn you into applesauce!" But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. "Turn us back into children," Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, this time first her left one and then her right, and turned the apples back into children. "All right," said Mauricia. "Let's go get Louis. He'll know what to do." "No," screamed Mrs. Gorf. "I'll turn you back into apples." And she wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, and stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. And even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her an apple, but none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Louis, the art teacher, walked in. "Where's Mrs. Gorf?" he asked. Nobody said a word. "Boy, am I hungry," said Louis. "I don't think Mrs. Gorf will mind if I eat this apple. After all, she always has so many." He picked up his apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it on his shirt, and ate it. So that's chapter 1. And if you want to read more of this book, I happen to know you have a few copies of it at your library. Have a great day. Thank you.